Chapter 11. The church bells were ringing 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night at the end of July. Everyone was gathering up pails and wet towels and pulling umbrellas across the beach. She couldn't wait until the last family dragged itself off the boardwalk toward the Cross Bay buses. She couldn't wait until the beach belonged to her. Graham had packed her a supper, spam on a roll with a tomato from Mrs. Colgan's Victory Garden, 3 or 4 celery sticks, and a bottle of orange juice. Lily sat as close to the water as she could without getting soaked. The tide was high. The waves crashed in, then sucked everything back out, shells and sand and a bit of seaweed. She thought about listening to Portia Face's Life with Graham this afternoon. Walter was in a rowboat now, waiting to find an American ship to bring him back. Lily looked out at the water, thinking about Poppy. He'd be on a ship one of these days, maybe even today, crossing the Atlantic, passing Rockaway. She shaded her eyes, watching a lone swimmer in the surf. She sat straight up. Who was that? Albert? He wasn't out far. He was swimming along in a line next to the beach. He wasn't swimming, though. He pulled himself to his feet, then threw himself down to take a couple of strokes before disappearing under the water. A moment later, he was up, sputtering, to start the whole thing over. If a lifeguard had been on the beach, he'd been out after Albert in 2 seconds. Lily stood up. Albert was trying to teach himself how to swim. He wasn't paying one bit of attention to the water. He wasn't trying to be part of it, to float along with it. He was fighting, arms slapping, head sticking up like a tennis ball. She wouldn't be able to eat her spam in peace. She'd have to watch him every minute. Albert was going to kill himself. Yes, there it was, a giant of a wave. She could see it swelling way out but moving toward him, picking up speed. She looked toward Albert, under, tennis ball head shooting up, an arm over his head, fingers wide apart. She stood up, trying to see how much time he had. She cupped her hands over her mouth, shouting. He couldn't hear her, probably couldn't see her. She took a step toward him. Then she was running, throwing herself into the icy coldness, slicing into the water, swimming diagonally. Of course, she was too late. The wave curled up high, and she was in the wrong position, just where it arched. It smashed into her, dragging her down, scraping her along the sand. She couldn't get her breath. The water was in her mouth, her throat, her nose. And then she was out of it, coughing up water, arms and legs scratched, lying on foamy sand. The last time she had done this, she was 6 years old. Poppy had caught her up in his arms and carried her back to the blanket. He had fed her tiny squares of egg salad, crunchy with celery. She looked up to see feet, skinny Albert feet, bony Albert legs with black and blue marks and grains of sand. She had forgotten all about them. She leaned on her hands to push herself up, then scrambled to her feet. Albert reached out. "I thought you were such a good swimmer," he said. As soon as she stopped coughing, she was going to drown him herself. She was going to take him by the skinny neck and throw him right back. She went back to the blanket and sat on the edge, wiping her face with her hands. Her nose and throat burned. She remembered the bottle of orange juice and reached for it. She knew he had followed her to the blanket, but she didn't look up. She wanted to say she could swim better than anyone she knew. Hadn't she saved the cat? But she wanted to say more, that the ocean belonged to her, that all winter at home in St. Albans she thought about it moving and rolling and waiting for her to come back. "How is the cat?" she said, knowing very well how the cat was. She had spied on Albert going in and out of the house for the last few days. She had let herself in when he was gone. The cat had fluffed up, soft orange and white. He kept her bed and litter box clean, in the kitchen too. "The cat is good," he said. He was sitting on the other end of the blanket now, dripping. She didn't know how he had gotten there. He pointed. "Do you see? The end of the jetty, a gray triangular rock." She nodded. "Yes. If you drew a straight line out all the way." "Europe," she said. He nodded. "Europe." "Want some juice?" she asked, not looking at him. He shook his head. She took a deep swallow of the juice, feeling it soothe her throat, watching a curl of smoke out on the horizon. "A ship," Albert said, "going to Europe." "No," she shaded her eyes. "It's a cutter, Coast Guard patrolling." It felt good to let him know she knew something, knew more than he did. She took another sip from the bottle. "My aunt said you can see the ships from here." "They form a convoy way out," she said, and pointed. "But some of them come from Brooklyn. The destroyers, the carriers, sometimes the tankers. You can see them at night if you watch long enough." "Going to Europe," Albert said. She nodded. "Going to win the war for us. Going to win for sure. And your father is going." Later, when she thought about it, she couldn't imagine saying what she had. It was just that she had been thinking of Portia Face's Life and Poppy crossing out there almost in front of her, and Albert saying, "I thought you were such a good swimmer." "I'm going too," was what she said. "At night. I'm going to row right out and swim the last bit. I'll have a rubber bag with dry clothes." It sounded wonderful, and she could see he was listening. He wasn't thinking of her as a silly kid wearing Gert's lipstick spying around. "I'm going to take a ship to my father. No one will stop to take me back to Brooklyn. There's a war on you now. Talking and talking, making up lies as she went along, and Albert leaning forward. You could do that, he asked. Of course. She stared at the cutter angling its way west toward Brooklyn until all she could see was a curl of smoke on the horizon. And then, just for a moment, it seemed possible. She could see herself reaching the troop ship, climbing aboard and sailing to Europe to find Poppy. And you can see those ships at night? He took a breath. Would you take me out to see them? Would you take me out tonight? She put the empty bottle back in her bag and started to roll up her towel. All right, she said, not quite looking at him. He stood up. I'm going to the house. I will feed my cat. You will come to my porch at 11? He started across the sand, not waiting for an answer. She sat there a minute longer, her heart pounding, thinking if this was truly the worst lie she had ever told.